Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on intelligence and personality. And the motivation for this is, honestly, anytime I decide to look at Reddit or any kind of forum or something like that, I usually when it involves personality, I usually have something that annoys me. I usually wind up reading something that annoys me. And one thing that really annoys me is that people don't seem to understand what intelligence is, and certainly that ignorance leads them to make a rather I'd just say inaccurate descriptions of personality, and its association with intelligence. I've tried to talk about this in the past, but I'll say it like this: that when you look at MBTI, it's not a system that really maps on well with other factors of personality, and well, I can't say factors of personality, but other psychological constructs per se. Like if you want to, I mean, you could just take and do a longitudinal study where you took and you just saw, okay, well, somebody has this personality type, and we're going to give them an IQ test, and when somebody has this personality type, we're going to give them an IQ test, and so on and so forth. But you really wouldn't be able to figure out what exactly is going on with the individuals that has the IQ linked to the personality. And it's the case that whenever you analyze IQ and its relationship to personality in the Big Five inventory, you find that IQ only has a positive correlation with one trait, and that's openness to experience. And it's a very limited correlation insofar that it's small. Doesn't mean it's completely insignificant, but it's small. And then its correlation is with verbal intelligence and not nonverbal intelligence, or crystallized, or what's considered as crystallized and not fluid intelligence. So it's just and even its association with that is, or correlation with that is marginal. Because one thing that the case is that IQ is far more general, or general intelligence is far more general than people would like to consider it. It is an antecedent to personality. It supersedes personality. Personality is something of an after effect. Certain conditions must be met for high levels of general intelligence, and certain conditions have to be met for a given personality complex. But the conditions that have to be met per se for the high levels of general intelligence are far more narrower than the conditions that have to be met for one's temperamental dispositions. There's a few factors that select for there's a few factors genetically that we can associate with high levels of general intelligence, but there's way more factors that you can associate when it comes to personality, and those things are not linked. They're not necessarily linked. You can find strong links between creativity and various personality factors, but you can't really, and you can find a strong link between some personality factors such as conscientiousness and working memory, and you can find stronger lines of correlation between one's levels of working memory and autism and various forms of autism. But that's not a ubiquitous phenomenon. You can't really associate much of IQ with many factors of personality. But what you can see with somebody who has a high IQ is that their IQ does influence their personality. You can observe that from what you from what you can find, if you just take a cohort of individuals that are members of Mensa, if you, I mean, it's, or if you take a cohort of individuals in a gifted program, typically, and it depends on the state. You'll find differences in personality, and and there's a reason for that, because it's the case that mean IQ. So I guess I'll pose it another way to understand it is this. Like, I'll pose it from a statistical standpoint. There's not a lot of let's say there's not a lot of people of any given population that have an IQ that's more than 1 to 2 standard deviations away from the mean, if not smack dab in the middle. And that's to the left or to the right. That's why severe retardation or severe giftedness are rarities. And it's the case that when people are thinking about this, they're not thinking of personality groups as populations, but they're populations. They're populations within a given population, but they're populations nonetheless. And it's the case that if you took the populations of SJs, if you took the population of NTs, if you took the population of FPs and gave them IQ batteries, it's not going to be the case that most of them are above average. Most of them are going to be average, slightly above, and it's going to be a very small number of them that are exceptional. I mean, it's Carl Jung is a good example. That man was highly intelligent, but I mean, he's not a characterization of all INFJs. Just as Einstein is not a characterization of all INTPs. That's not even. I mean, like, I don't think it's. Well, yeah, I think it's necessary for me to say that, because it's not the case that even, and I'll concede that possibly NTs might be overrepresented in in a population of IQs that are more than a standard deviation away from the mean. I think that, yeah, there's probably a good chance for that, but I think that the reason for that is because of the trait of openness to experience, but not necessarily NTs. You'd have to say that has to do with their intuition more so than necessarily their thinking functions, because it's even the case with NTs. I mean, you can be motivated to be systematizing and to look at the world and try to make sense of it. But IQ is closer to the degree of hardware than it is the software. It's not the thing, it's the thing running the programs, but it's not the programs. The programs would be the cognitive functions, the IQ would not be the cognitive functions. It's not something you're going to find, and even when you look for intelligence in the brain, you can't localize it. You cannot localize it to any one region. What you can find is there's a constellation of regions that are sufficiently developed and robust in these individuals, and they're gonna have different regions that are more pronounced and developed depending on their levels of expertise and predilection and interest towards fields like whether it be music or mathematics. But it's the case that your IQ will run you, but you're not running it. You are the personality or the temperamental variance the personality is a description of temperamental factors. What you have certainly IQ will influence what you have a taste for and what you don't have a taste for, to a degree, but it's limited. It's very narrow. It's very narrow in its capacities to predict temperamental factors within people. Because you would think so. There's a whole line of arguments that have fallen to the wayside in the psychological domain, because you would think that if somebody has a high IQ that they're not going to be more impulsive than the next person, but that's not the case. You'd think that all people with high IQs would be socially awkward, but that's not the case. You would think that all individuals. Well, there's a lot of things you could come up with, like, because people have for a long time. I mean, people have, but there's differences, just as there's varying degrees and differences in the normative and the standard population. There's differences and variance in the outlying population. Because there's enough of them for their... No, I won't even say there's enough of them. There just are, because temperamental variances account for more of why things look like they do in the world of human experience than almost anything else. The world itself, what goes on in the world itself, can be accounted for to a certain degree by the IQ per capita but of a place. But the phenomenology of said person, yeah, just go ahead and throw... IQ's a factor, don't get me wrong, it's a factor, but it's not, it can't predict everything, I guess is the best way to say it. Intelligence doesn't predict everything. It just won't predict everything. It won't predict everything when it comes to success. It can only account for 0.25 of the variance. That's like 25 to 20% of it as a whole large slice that's not accounted for. But factors like conscientiousness and creativity and other societal and cultural and mostly rearing factors or environmental background factors account for success and in terms of monetary than any one of those things by themselves, and certainly more so than IQ. But it is the case that if you wanted to almost guarantee somebody to have high levels of success, you would want them to have sufficient levels of conscientiousness and to be within the 99th percentile for intelligence. That's the way that it goes. If you just wanted to guarantee their success. I mean, that's not necessarily a guarantee, but that's close enough. I mean, in terms of statistics. I'm speaking from a purely statistical standpoint. And, but it's the case that even when you're dealing with other people that are highly gifted, you have some similarities. You may have some similarities in your overall experience, but I can attest that no 1-2 gifted persons are alike for the most part, and no one kind of, even with IQ, it's not as if somebody's cognitive profile is necessarily the same as another person, because the way that an IQ test works, I can draw it out. I can draw it out for you. So let me see. Let's say we're going to test for fluid. We're going to test for fluid intelligence. We're going to test for your spatial, visual, reasoning capacities. we're going to test for your verbal fluency and reasoning capacity, computational, and numeric, reasoning capacities. My pen's running out of ink. Damn it. Yeah. And and some kind of memory item, typically working memory, if that's not embedded in the fluid intelligence component, which it typically is. So an IQ test will have it such that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and depending on whose test and scale it is, 5 to 6, or even as little, possibly as little as 4, meaningful categories. And it's going to be the case that you can score, like you can't fail an IQ test, but the maximum score you could have in any, well, depending on an individual, depending on the scale, we're just going to say roughly it's 200. But most tests, it's 140 and 160. But just for hypothetical sakes, we're just going to say it's 200. Okay? You could get 200 in each of these categories. Let's say in one category for fluid, you got 145. And let's say for spatial, that's where you get your 200. Let's say for verbal, you get maybe 100. Let's say for computational, you get 125. Let's say for the memory, you get 200, because that's believable. I mean, honestly, that's believable. You're going to add these scores together. And then you're going to divide them by the number of items you have. And according to this, you'd have an IQ of 154. But you'll notice you have an overall score of 154, which puts you in the 99th percentile. Don't get me wrong, that's significant. But it's not 160. But there's 2 items in terms of the overall battery that you got perfect scores on. And it's the case that when you're talking about somebody's levels of giftedness, it's usually those 2 items on any given battery that's really stand out, that's extremely apparent whenever you're dealing or interacting with that individual. The reason I say that that's believable, because it's kind of close to home for how I tend to test, and it's the case that you have 3 items that you're in the 99th percentile for, but you're in the 50th and the 75th for the other 2. You're not in, and sometimes it could be such that you're in the 10th, and that's legitimately a thing for some individuals. They can be they can be highly gifted in other areas and deficient in others. But it's the case that it's honestly super rare to be gifted in more than one category. And so it's the case that even with being cognitively able, there's so much variation in people that it's not even funny. And even when you're looking at that collection of individuals, the personalities vary. Not in any way that's any more meaningful than the normal population, because you can give them the Big Five inventory, and they're going to score some way on conscientiousness. They're going to score some way on openness, agreeableness, and extroversion. And I promise you, they're not going to be the same. It's even just when you're breaking it down between the dichotomy of introversion and extroversion. Introverts tend to score the population of individuals that comprise the 99th percentile tend to be introverted. According to some studies, about 60% of the population, but there's a good 40% that's still extroverted. And it's not the case that, and I'm willing to bet, well, just because we've seen it with studies. So the trait agreeableness, as one's levels of verbal influency increase, one's levels of compassion and politeness tend to increase. People who are gifted in verbal fluency, in their verbal fluency capacities, tend to be overly empathic and tend to be politically liberal. They tend to be the egalitarian social. Not all. I shouldn't say never mind. I'm not gonna say that. But they tend to be the egalitarian types. Like that's legitimately them, and they tend to want to all be lawyers. I'm just kidding. I don't know that. I don't know if that's true. But I mean, I've met a lot like that. But that's the case. And well, then maybe not lawyers, but politicians, like something, or social workers, or like work for a non-profit or something. I promise you, like they're teaming with these individuals. But it's the case that that's a reality, and as one's levels of nonverbal items in terms of that would be verbal fluid, that would be spatial visual reasoning, and fluid intelligence. That the more that those things increase, the greater likelihood of being disagreeable in the individual. There's certain personality factors that are definitely largely associated with intelligence, but it's just that high levels of intelligence isn't a straightforward game, because you can have somebody who has an IQ of 160, but that's not necessarily a description of just exactly what makes it the case that they have that IQ of 160, and what areas they might really, really, really be frighteningly adept at, or have an aptitude for. But yeah, in short, it's just a case that intelligence and personality have some correlation, but not a significant correlation to the point where you can use one to predict for the other. In no study has it been demonstrated, or in no way can it be re-represented. Well, because people have tried. Like, people don't. It's not barring people's attempts to find things. I mean, this isn't barring people's attempts to find things. People have tried, but it's just the case that you can't find any more meaningful statistical prediction for high levels of intelligence other than IQ. That's it. So if you really want to know, your personality probably can't tell you, but an IQ test can. And it's the case that most people are not going to be above average. And it's the case that most people that go to college are around 120. If you go to college, if you go to college, that's a good predictor for you at least having an IQ of 120. Most people in any given university any given university have an IQ of 120 and possibly 130. That's a majority of the population. It's even the case like in graduate school that the average goes up to 130. I mean, that's the average. That's just most people. I don't think people realize how exceedingly rare high levels of general intelligence is. It's rare. I mean, like, when I'm telling you it's rare, it's rare. It's not to say that there aren't a lot of those people in the world, but most people aren't those people. That's all I'm saying, from a statistical standpoint. So, yeah, that's my video, and thank you for watching, and hopefully you found it interesting.